Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Aarna Sahu, host of Aarna's News, where on this podcast channel, I aim to eliminate the gender gap in the STEM fields by featuring inspiring female professionals and highlighting their stories and accomplishments to further encourage girls. Today on episode 97.
It is. And I would say another piece of that, there's like two ends of a project that are really hard. One is like get started, and the other one is finish it and ship it. And they both have a similar issue with either fear or perfectionism getting in the way. Like, you've heard the saying, like, perfect is the enemy of good, where I just made a post about this on LinkedIn actually, where it's actually relatively easy to get started. It's really hard to finish it because you have to first of all have like willpower to slog through the parts that are like not fun, because that's easy to do. And I have that trouble on my film stuff where I'm like, okay, I wrote it, I filmed it. Now editing it is a nightmare. It's like finishing it is really hard. So you got to have like grit and willpower. And then you also have to know when to let it go and move on to the next thing. And that's where perfectionism can also be a little bit of a hindrance. So that's not to say that people can't do it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Aarna Sahu, host of Aarna's News, where on this podcast channel, I aim to eliminate the gender gap in the STEM fields by featuring inspiring female professionals and highlighting their stories and accomplishments to further encourage girls. Today, on episode 97, I'm pleased to announce our guest, Shelby Moledina. Shelby is a game and film director with over 20 years of experience in games and over 30 titles shipped. She has held a variety of game development roles that blend her technical, creative, and business skills: gameplay programmer, executive producer, director of product, game director, and chief operating officer. She has worked for WB Games, DENA, and Roblox, and co-founded Double Loop Games in 2019. In 2024, she founded her second startup, Glowy Pixels Entertainment, to explore transmedia projects at the nexus of film and games and technology. She has won multiple awards and recognition for my game design skill and leadership, and is particularly proud of Double Loop Games winning the 2022 Global Game Industry Awards for upcoming indie and workplace diversity and inclusion. So thank you so much, Shelby, for being here today. Before we dive into the questions, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shelby, and I'm really glad to be here. I was really excited and impressed when you reached out about this podcast. I am also really inspired by you. Sorry. Sorry. I'm also really inspired by you and sort of your core cohort of aspiring game developers who are out there and talking to people and making things happen at a way younger age than I did. So I'm very impressed.
Thank you so much. So my first question for you is, tell us a bit about your career path.
Well, when I was young, we had a computer at home and I played games, but at some point when I was around 11, I played this game, King's Quest 6, and another one, The Secret of Monkey Island. And that kind of, those games were really beautiful stories, immersive worlds, and they just like sparked my imagination. I was like, I need to make games. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I don't know how I get there, but like that was like an internal kind of North Star. There was like nothing else I really wanted to do. So I spent a lot of years trying to figure out, how does that happen? How do I get in? That was like pre-internet really, so there was no information. So I decided my in was probably starting with programming because I knew that was a core skill that's needed. I also write and do art, so I just had to kind of decide my path in, and I started when I graduated. When I was in college, I had an unpaid internship at a local game company in Eugene, a little startup that was just getting going, and then I graduated college and I needed a paid job and I couldn't find a games job. So I worked at a startup in Seattle that was non-games tech. And I felt like, well, I'll get some experience. And then after about 2 years of that, I was able to come back to Eugene. I started as a gameplay programmer and level designer at Pipeworks Software in Eugene. And I mean, honestly, from the first day, my tech director was like, I'm going to make you a producer. And I was like, what's a producer? And it's just because I tend to organize the people around me. So I kind of, in a small studio like that, I got to do lots of different roles and I kind of learned the business like top to bottom. I moved around between being a gameplay programmer and a producer, and some design and business, and learned all about that. And then I was at Pipeworks for 8 years and I learned a lot. We shipped a lot of titles there as a work for hire studio. And then when I moved to San Francisco, I I did a little time at Roblox, and which was the kids are amazing. And then I went to DNA, which is where I really started to learn about mobile games and free to play, and kind of had this like boot camp where we launched 30 games in 30 weeks, and it was nuts. But was in the data and like saw what worked on mobile games and what didn't. That was amazing and kind of started me down this path of then at Warner Brothers, my focus was also mobile games and live operations and kind of helping teams across the Warner Brothers portfolio to who had amazing games, like help them level up on how do you plan for live operations? How do you create a core game design loop that will support long-term, interesting live ops that you can do? And I again tend to sort of move around and jump onto new opportunities and new learnings, and kind of came out of that with some more tools in my toolbox, which was a deeper dive on monetization, deeper dive on live ops, and director of product on some games. So, and then I co-founded my company Double Loop Games with Emily Greer because I had wanted to do that, but I knew nothing about fundraising or running a business, and she had really done that before. So we kind of complemented each other's skills, and we had a very similar outlook on culture and how we wanted to build the company and how important people are. So we started the company, and then that was another 5 years of just insane learnings, and I'm doing 9 jobs at a time, learning about fundraising, learning about business, and coming out of that with a whole perspective I did not have before. That's given me a lot more things that I want to learn. So that was sort of my journey through.
I love that. And with your interest, you didn't really know what game development was and how you could dabble in it, but then you kind of realized that, okay, you need to know a little bit of programming and a little bit of art. So you decided to like work on that first. And I love how you took interest and you decided to be proactive about that, even though you might not have had the resources at the time. I think that's really cool.
Thank you. And I feel like I've been in games over 20 years, and I feel like that's what I've been. That's my number one thing I tell aspiring game developers is like, just make stuff. Like, make it right now. Don't wait for permission. Just do stuff. And yeah, you aren't going to know everything, but like, just start, do something small, do it again and again. And I did that on a small scale back when I was breaking in. Like, I had a computer graphics, 3D graphics class at the University of Oregon, and I wrote a shader, and I brought that to my interview at Pipeworks. And the good thing about bringing a piece of code or something in your portfolio for any discipline is that the people who are interviewing you want to have something to talk about. So basically it avoided me having to do like a very standard generic like computer science test. It was like we talked through it, and we talked through the thought process and what was happening. And it just made the interview a lot more meaningful. And so I always recommend that to people. And then, as you said, like there wasn't a lot of information about this before. I didn't even know what a producer was. But now there's so much out there that people are able to do what I used to advise. You're able to do that to like a much higher level. Like you can join game jams, and you can learn, you can join a team, and you can do this like before you're ever part of a studio. And there's just so much. I know it's still kind of mysterious to people who want to get into games. So I'm not saying it's like crystal clear, but there are more resources. And one thing I've been doing during my sabbatical since Double Loop is doing more mentorship. And I actually see that a lot on LinkedIn now. A lot of people will sort of take the leap and like cold message me and ask to chat about what they're doing and how they could break in. And I'm happy to do it. And I also know there are so many professionals on LinkedIn, like happy and willing to do that if you just ask.
Absolutely. And this is a great segue to my next question, which is what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours? And do you have any tips to succeed?
Yes, I can go a little more depth to what I just said. If you wanted to the question of a career similar to mine is interesting. And I know it's not particularly that, but it's funny because if you talk to 100 game developers, you'll get 100 different stories of how they got into games. Because something you said earlier is exactly right. It's about being proactive and grabbing opportunities. So, and not everyone is the same. So for me, I really like having a varied day. I like having a broad set of skills, more so than I like doing one deep, deep, deep project. the same thing every day for a year and like mastering that. I prefer to have like more tools in my toolbox. And so for me, the right path was opportunistically, do what I can, get started. And then once you're in there, just every time something needed to be done, and because we were a small studio, there wasn't enough people to do everything. So when something needed to be done, I'd raise my hand and be like, well, I don't know how to do it, but I'm willing to try. And that basic attitude is what I advise to a lot of people. It's not right for everybody. Like some people will become the most technical individual contributor, engineer, and I could never do that. So their path is different than mine, but I think the principle is the same. Like just get started, make stuff, make it for yourself. Don't expect to make your magnum opus on your first project. I see that a lot where that'll trip people up. They think I've got this giant idea, so I need to get everything in a line to do that. And then that actually prevents them from ever getting started because what you want to do is actually make small things repeat, small things repeat, small things repeat, and you learn a lot. So, that's kind of broad advice to everybody. Does that make sense? Do you have any more questions about that?
No, not really, but I want to touch up on that because, for me especially, I have a bit of a perfectionist mindset, so it's really, really hard for me to take the first step, as you just mentioned. But as you gradually improve and you kind of build your skills, it's so much easier to actually do something in your mind and bring it to life. So, of course, the first step is always going to be hard, but after that, it's a very rewarding path.
It is. And I would say another piece of that, there's like two ends of a project that are really hard. One is like get started, and the other one is finish it and ship it. And they both have a similar issue with um, either fear or perfectionism getting in the way. Like, you've heard the saying, like, perfect is the enemy of good, where I just made a post about this on LinkedIn actually, where it's very sometimes it's actually relatively easy to get started. It's really hard to finish it because you have to first of all have like willpower to slog through the parts that are like not fun because that's easy to do. And I have that trouble on my film stuff where I'm like, okay, I wrote it, I filmed it. Now editing it is a nightmare. It's like finishing it is really hard. So you got to have like grit and willpower. And then you also have to know when to let it go and move on to the next thing. And that's where perfectionism can also be a little bit of a hindrance. So that's not to say that people can't do it, but it is to say like just get started even if you think you're not ready, and then recognize the value of finishing and shipping and starting the next thing, because that last 10% of finishing it, it's like in your mind it's not such a big deal, but it is. And as you go through that over and over, you will learn better how to plan upfront so that that end part is less tedious and horrible. So it's really important to go through the full cycle.
100% agreed. And my question for you is, what is a common myth about your profession that you want to debunk?
Hmm. Oh man, there's a lot. I think the simplest, well, I don't know. Actually, okay, so there's a simple throwaway one, which is like everyone thinks making games is playing games all day. Okay, that's not true. But we do actually play some games. I play a lot of games for research. But I think maybe one of the biggest myths I want to debunk, and is actually what my web series that I'm creating is about, is that there still persist these stereotypes in culture about who is making games. And there's not a lot of pop culture media about game development, but what is out there tends to reinforce the stereotypes of the programmer, the cis white het guy making games, and you know the girls are the admins or whatever. And or if there is a woman in game development, it's kind of token or kind of male construction of a female character. So and I know your podcast is really about this, like breaking down those barriers to STEM. And my show is about it's a fictional narrative web series about a fictional indie dev team led by a woman. And the perspective that I'm trying to show and surface is the experience of a different type of person who's making games, not that dude. It's like there are so many women and minorities and people of all gender and all ethnicities making games. Like if you go to GDC, you just see like thousands of people who are all unique and different. And that's not represented in media. So that's what I'm trying to do with the show is to, well, tell stories about game development like they're so crazy and funny that you don't even have to make it up. Like game development is hilarious and bizarre and crazy. There's always like something going on the surface that the conspiracy theories out on Reddit don't know about. There's always like some reason for something. So I want to surface those stories and show aspiring game developers what it's kind of like, but also show like, hey, I know it's hard to go into a profession when you don't see anybody like yourself. And I can't represent everybody in the show, but there'll be a bigger variety of people to sort of look at and be like, oh, I can relate to that. Um, One of those things I thought when I was getting into games is I thought I wanted to be a game designer, but then I looked at the two designers we had at our studio at that time, and I was like, well, I'm nothing like this one, and I'm nothing like that one. I can't see myself being a game designer. And that turned out to be completely wrong. And I've been a game designer for many years, but that is how I felt at the early time. So I can, I remember that very clearly. And that's a big mission of the show.
I love what you're doing, bringing more representation because media portrays a lot of people in STEM, honestly, to be like really nerdy,
Yeah.
have like no hygiene, and like no one wants to be around them in that profession. But what we're doing right now is to actually, change that and make it more appealing because it is a really appealing field. And I love what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a woman who I always wore like dresses to work when there were 60 other dudes and they were wearing like swim shorts to work and they were like, "Why are you dressed up? Is there something going on?" I was like, "No. This is how I am. I like to get dressed. It's fun for me." So I'd say, everyone be yourself. I now have hot pink hair. Um, One project, I don't know if you saw it on LinkedIn. I very randomly decided before GDC this year that I was gonna take a selfie with every person I saw with pink hair at GDC. And it was like just for fun, but it turned into this really meaningful thing where I I would see someone with pink hair and I'd kind of walk up to them and they'd look a little wary. But then within like 7 seconds, I was like, I'm just trying to take selfies with everyone with pink hair that I see at GDC. And they would like light up and then we would talk and then we'd have like a long conversation. And I met a lot of people that were really interesting and really awesome. And it also tended to skew toward not entirely, but a little more toward junior and aspiring developers and indie developers rather than the people I have in the past mostly interacted with when pitching to publishers and VCs and things. There is variety there, but it's like by doing this selfie project, the pink hair selfie project, I just got really immersed and connected to the more independent and varied ways that people make games. And that was really inspiring. So yeah, that's how I looked around and I was like, well, I got like 67 photos of people with pink hair. Next year, I want to do the whole rainbow.
I love that. I love that project. And so yeah, my question for you is if you could step into my shoes, what would you have asked yourself that I didn't?
Ooh. Um, well, can I ask you a question first? You're doing this podcast, and do you aspire to be in game development or tech later on? And if
I
so, what do you want to focus on?
I do see myself in tech for sure. Like talking to so many different women in STEM, I think it's definitely a passion that I've had, and it's been a little more fiery lately, but it's definitely tech that I want to be in. My friends actually want to go into game development, so I was like, okay, that's a possible career path for them, but I never really considered it for myself. So I think it's definitely a path that I would like to explore if possible. But within tech, I don't know. I have so many different interests. I love cloud computing. There's AI and machine learning that everyone's talking about. And now there's game development, so I'm still gonna be exploring.
That makes sense. So let's see. A question that you would ask me. I think if I were you, I would ask either me or, anyone who's working on some type of thing you're interested in. And by the way, I really commend you for having lots of interests. Like you're at a time where in your life where that's amazing and good to explore everything. And like I said, try to learn something about everything. So I think I would ask me like how would I start to learn more about specific roles or fields that I was interested in? Maybe that's not as opaque to you as it was to me when I was that age, but um, that's sort of where I would say I think a lot of people get stuck. Like, where do I get started? How do I get started?
I love that. And even if you don't have the interest, like if you're not sure what you want to do, definitely exploring is the best path to go.
Yeah.
Because you can dabble in so many interests and see if something, is fun to you.
That's so true because a lot of times the learning includes doing things and realizing, oh, I actually don't want to do that. And that's totally fine. And before I did group projects, I wouldn't have known that I was a natural organizer of people, and that kind of led me into being a successful producer. And you just don't know those things about yourself until you're kind of put into a situation where you need to be scrappy and figure it out. And there is definitely something about deadlines that really help, at least help me, but I think they help a lot of people, where it's like, okay, if you're doing a 1 week game jam or 48-hour, in my case, I do 48-hour film projects. It's like the time pressure means you got to figure it out. And kind of under that pressure and in a little bit of the forge, the fire of the forge, you kind of learn some things about yourself that will help you figure out what you want to try next.
Absolutely. And my question for you is what are the best resources or books that have helped you find your career path?
Hmm. Um, I would say that for me, I learned best by talking with people. I have game design books and I have lots of books, but I learn by doing, I learn by having a mentor, I learn by discussing all angles of problems with different people with different perspectives, and then sorting out from there what do I feel is right for me. I also, honestly, I tell people like almost everything I've learned was by making a mistake somewhere. And that is how I learn. It's like, just do it. And then it's like, oh, this thing I didn't know, like I should have been hedging against that. So then after 20 years, I've sort of built that internal kind of spidey sense about, well, yeah, this could be not a big deal, but I've seen it go wrong many times. So let's try to let's actually like think through this right now. So that's honestly been my best teacher. But I'd have to list out a lot of, for me, it's people, mentors, people who've been willing to take the time and talk with me. And um, like recently I've been trying to learn film editing and I've been kind of dabbling, but I met a person on LinkedIn who wants to break into games, and he and I have been sort of exchanging, like teaching each other. He's been doing film editing professionally for like 12 years. And he gave me this like really generous, like 2 hours of his time last week and walked me through the best workflow for editing my project, which I had been doing kind of like in a tangled way. And I learned so much in that 2 hours, more than I ever would have learned in a class or a book, just the way that I absorb information. So, and I'm helping him and other people with their portfolios and resumes and connections on how to get into the game industry. So I'd say, for me, finding other people who have skill sets that I don't have and then helping them with the skill sets I do have, that's been the very best way to learn for me.
I love that, and it goes to show that there are people out there willing to help you.
Yeah.
Um, of course, you might have to help them in order for them to help you, but there are people out there who wanna do good and just provide you with information that they have.
Yeah, it's and I don't ever feel like it's too transactional. So there's been like two ways for me. I've been like, I just offer help on LinkedIn or wherever it is. I just offer help, no strings attached. And then on the other side of it, when I've posted updates about my film, I tend to post updates about like a specific thing that I need. I'm like, does anyone know anything about this? Like one of them was I was looking to talk to someone who had worked as a community manager on a cozy game before. And it was a very specific thing. And I find that people respond overwhelmingly positively when you have a specific thing you need help with. And I get so much interaction from those. And honestly, more people than I could ever talk to about that topic. And so I feel like sometimes it can be exactly reciprocal, but sometimes it's also like a balancing of karma where it's like I've asked for help and I give help. And overall it's a community of like helping each other.
I love that. And my question for you is what do you think is a vital factor that shaped your career? What was your life before learning it, and what was your life after learning it?
Um, hmm. I think a vital thing that has shaped my career started before I ever was in games. I used to, from when I was in first grade, I was dragging my parents to like theater auditions. And I realized, it started as a love of wanting to perform. But through that, especially through high school when I was in musicals and it was these big casts and crew, and we'd spend the whole evenings and weekends together, I realized through that what I really love more than any specific part of the craft is often just creative collaboration with other people. It's just like, let's just make stuff and to do it together. And a lot of times the experience, this is something I learned through games actually, is that a lot of times the experience of making the game is very different than the experience of the game being out in the world and people's response to the game. Because you might work on a game for 1 year or 7 years, and those 1 or 7 years are great or meaningful or awful because of the people you work with. And I've definitely stayed in job situations that were pretty unhealthy, but because I was like so bonded and really enjoyed the people that I worked with closely. So for me, that's been a big motivating factor. And before I got into games, I had this dream of like, well, I like to play giant RPGs. And I was like, so my dream is to eventually work at Bethesda. I lost that about, I don't know, some 5, 8 years in because I realized the experience of working on smaller games is something I actually really enjoy. So working on games that I still love, but I realized that my love of RPGs didn't mean that I actually really wanted to make giant RPGs because the logistics of making giant projects and the length of time and all those things. So since then, I've just like better and better through my life been able to sort of prioritize who I work with and sort of the way we're going to work. And then of course the game has to be the right game for the players. But it's like all those things kind of need to work together. And um, when we started Double Loop, Emily, my co-founder, and I had previously really bonded around a principle that I've worked with a lot of people, not a lot. I've worked with some people in game development who are extremely talented, but have, for different reasons, like a real toxic effect on the team. And the companies I'd been at had felt very handcuffed to those people that, like, oh, if we let them go, we know they're toxic or it's causing these problems, but if we let them go, we're going to not be able to do this thing. And going through that cycle over and over, I've realized that the toxic effect on teams is just really outsized compared to whatever work output that person was doing. So Emily and I had really bonded about like our company. Well, we bonded before we ever knew we were going to make a company together, but just that sort of the toxic jerk is never worth it, ever, ever, never, ever worth it in the long run. Like you might feel like it is, but it's not. And then when she and I did eventually start Double Loop, we were just very like human and culture first about we're a no ego company. We're about the creativity and working together. We're very accepting of each other. We hired lots of people who are really amazing at their jobs, and it was a really safe and trusting and collaborative and helpful place. Like if anybody had to do something else outside, like other people would rush to cover. And I've never really had that exact flow before, and it was really special.
I love that. And it goes to show that, interests may change and it's okay to accept that. Like your initial interest of wanting to make RPGs changed, and you're okay with that, and here you are. So I love that.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. It's like if you're going to have a long, long game career, you're going to work on a lot of games, and you need to have, there needs for you, or whatever it is you're doing, it's like the joy of doing the thing needs to not be 100% tied to what game you're working on. Because if you're like, I only want to make games if I can make this specific genre, then you're going to miss out on like a lot of learnings about yourself. You probably are not going to work consistently because it's like you'll be doing this, then you'll be doing that, and then you'll come back around and work on a thing that's closer creatively to what you want to do, and then you'll do something else. And I just don't think it's possible for most people to string together a whole career of just your favorite genre or type of game.
Absolutely. And because we have some additional time, my last question for you is what's one thing you wish you had known when you began your career?
Hmm. Well, there are things I kick myself about, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how or if I would have done it differently. Like in my 20s, I worked crazy hours. We were doing console games where there was no digital way to make an update. So the game that you sent to Xbox for mastering was the game that would go live, and doing an update after that would cost a lot of money. So it really led to a lot of crunch and long hours. And I think in my 20s, I let that sort of feeling of responsibility to the team and my managers, and I was learning a lot. I let that sort of take over my life. And on the one hand, I'm really grateful to that period of time, but and I also could never do that again, where I went like 6 years without being able to make even like a dinner plan, because there would always be like an emergency in the evening. And at the time, I felt like, because I hadn't had a lot of other jobs, I was like, well, I guess this is how it is. And like my manager says it's this way. So I guess that's true. And then after having worked at a few different places, I realized, oh, there are lots of ways to do this. Like that person who said it can only be done this way, it's like that's the way that works for them, but it isn't the way it has to be. So it took me like quite a few years to sort of confidently unwind that and then run my teams differently. And so I'm like grateful to that time because I learned a lot, but it also was a very high anxiety time. It like really took a big toll on me personally and mentally and emotionally. So I wish that I'd had that experience and confidence to know it could be a different way and to not stay in that situation as long that I did. But at that time in my life, I'm not sure I had a ton of other options, and that sort of bedrock gave me the ability to be a lot choosier later. So that's a hard thing, but I do advise people, if you're in like basically an emotionally abusive relationship with your employer, that's not how it has to be. And I would definitely advise leaving and going somewhere else and not just like sitting through it, because it like shredded me up.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Shelby, for being here today. Before we end off, do you have any last words to the audience?
Um, yeah, I'm excited to see what the next generation of game developers are making. I always think the most creative and interesting things come from people who are just getting started and have a lot of really different ideas. So I am very excited to follow you all through your game jams and your updates and your games. Like, keep posting them on LinkedIn. I'd love to follow your games on Steam and whatever you're doing. I'm just really excited to see what comes out in the next wave.
Thank you so much, Shelby. I absolutely love talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thus, that concludes the episode for this week. If you want to know more about how I relate to these amazing topics, then stay tuned for upcoming episodes. A free way to support this show is by leaving it a 5-star rating and a review on the player you are listening to. Let me know what you enjoy about this podcast, as it's a chance to tell me what you love about the show, and it helps others discover it too. Once again, thank you for finding me, and I hope we stay in touch with each other. Zito, you're listening to Aarna Sahu, the host of Aarna's News. Toodles!